welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. I was watching just a few days ago a particular video that to me felt very disturbing to watch. This was a particular document that was talking about people who are now beginning to ascend the heights of Mount Everest. Now, unusual enough, Mount Everest was one of those rare places that only experienced climbers with the right place, state of mind, and spirit decided to ascend to. But it's turned into something of what of a playground for people who seem to have the kind of money that will be able to take them to go on these particular journeys. But what even becomes more concerned is the amount of people that begin to be able to take on this particular challenge. In other words, the mystery of the mountain seems to has been forgotten. Well, much like Mount Everest, our national parks seem to be coming that way as well. On the program today, we're going to be talking with someone who spent almost 40 years in the National Park Service, as well as receiving the highest rewards from the Department of the Interior. We'll be learning about how the National Park Service, which was created in 1916, became an immensely popular concept with visitation equal to the national population of the United States each year. Along the way, the service has picked up a few issues and stresses that endanger the mission of the National Park Service. On the program today, we're joined by author the book, Dr. Gil Lusk, who's going to be talking about his book, National Parks, Our Living Treasure, A Time for Concern. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Dr. Gil Lusk. Dr. Lusk, thank you for being on the program today.
Daniel, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now,
and please just call me Gil.
Gil, that works for me then. Now, let's talk about, first of all, how you got involved with this. I mean, it goes back to when you're in your late teens going into your early 20s, and this isn't something that people easily get involved in, from what I understand.
Well, when I was in college, my major was in American history. And of course, that's one of those things that you're kind of limited in when you graduate. During the time that I was in college, a program came out called a student trainee program with the National Park Service, and that was back in 1962. I was lucky enough to get selected for that between my freshman and sophomore years. Catered or kind of planned my curriculum based on the success I was having and the fun that I was having working for the National Park Service, getting a lot of respect for the agency and what it tried to do. And that was enough to get me going, and I've been going pretty much ever since, at least strongly until 97 when I retired.
Now, you've pretty much been all over the place when it comes to this particular experience of being, would you call it a park ranger? Could we call it that from this point forward, or was it more deeply involved where you just didn't sit up in a tower watching and waiting for fires?
And basically the bulk of my career was spent managing various national parks, Glacier National Park, Big Bend National Park, some historical sites. I was there in 1976 when we brought Valley Forge in from a state park into the National Park Service and helped bring online Wolf Trap Farm Park for the performing arts in the Washington, D.C. area. In a sense, I had a very lucky career in that I had an opportunity to experience many parks and various types of parks. They weren't just all one kind, and really had a really good career and enjoyed every minute of it, and have a great deal of respect for what the Park Service is trying to do.
Now, for the listeners, let's give them an idea of what the National Park Service, its original or its mission was back in the early part of the 1900s, and that way they get a better sense of what it is.
Yeah, it comes back to a time back just after 1900 when Teddy Roosevelt was president. There was Muir and Pinchot and some really fine minds dealing with the issues of conservation and environment at an early time. The U.S. Forest Service was created shortly after 1900, And then in 1916, the National Park Service came on board again, and the mission of the National Park Service is quite simple. It basically has an obligation to deliver those things that it manages into the future unimpaired. Now, basically what that means to me is that my concern is not so much for what happened 50 years ago. It's what's going to happen in terms of the Park Service for the grandchildren of today and tomorrow. It is it's a philosophical mission. It's a very different mission. It has been copied around the world. There's very few nations you can go without a national park. And basically, the mission is unimpaired. And to me, that means in Yellowstone, we don't build townhouses and we don't destroy anything. We basically shelter, protect, and let evolution take its course. And yet, within that context, provide for America and the world to view and experience these resources for their innate values.
Well, and here's the thing. That's why I brought up the story of Everest, because I had a concern after seeing that. I remember back in, I think it was 1972, first visiting Yosemite Park, because I lived in Southern California, and that almost became sort of like a backyard growing up. You know, now you can barely even get into the park. It seems.
That's exactly right.
And and I know that you spent a good portion of your career up at Glacier National Park, which I've also been to. So here I was going to these places as a child, but then I started realizing as I got much older and went back to visit, much like the experience of Everest that I was describing earlier, is that these were places that, although beautiful, there were some aspects you could feel had just changed, which change happens, but it was a feeling underneath like the change wasn't so good. In other words, it's like in the words of Jean-Michel Cousteau, saying there were places I used to go as a child that I no longer recognize. And even his own father, Jacques Cousteau, would say the very same thing. know. And I know, let's go ahead and start one of the stories that I'd like you to talk about. It's one of the first ones you talk about in your book, is Castillo de San Marcos, National Monument in Florida. And I like this story because it shows where you have this idea about something, and this is a national monument, for instance, and how the idea came along to say, well, why don't we do this? Why don't you go ahead and talk about what this place is, your involvement, and then how they worked at deciding to sort of add something a little extra that you kind of scratch your head and go, well, I get the idea, but.
Well, basically the Castillo de San Marcos construction started on that back in 1672. And it is a fortification, a Spanish fortification, to protect the gold routes from Central and South America back to Spain. The town itself was created in 1565. The amazing thing about the Castillo and the history of St. Augustine is when I was growing up in school, I got the English version of American history. I really never got the Spanish version. I knew about Jamestown and Plymouth Rock. I knew about Fort Raleigh. But I had very little inkling as to the involvement of Spain in what are now Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Florida. So it was a very interesting experience to experience that history and learn of it. And it's a small area, but the fort is in magnificent condition. It is made of coquina stone, which is basically a compressed series of prehistoric shells. And the English found that very irritating because they would fire cannonballs at St. Augustine when they came down for a raid. And instead of breaking, the coquina just simply absorbs the shell and makes a little hole, but it doesn't crack or break. So the fort was never really taken by enemy forces, whether French or English or any. Well, it's a beautiful place. It basically has pristine structure. And then back around 1964, there was a discovery of a system called the Sonnet Lume, program. If you've been over to the pyramids, they still produce a program. It's called Sound and Light. And basically, it is an evening program where you sit and lights and voices come out of the darkness using a script that is based on the history of the site. It's a very it can be a very chilling experience for people. Well, it was seen by some individuals here in the States, and they said, "Wow, this is really neat. Let's do it." And one of the sites that was chosen was the Castillo de San Marcos. And basically, what happened to that historic site should never happen to a historic site. Basically, in order to install the Sound and Light program, there was some 16 miles of wire and other things installed in and around the Castillo because there had to be speakers and lights out on the grounds and elsewhere. There was a huge control room put into one of the bastions. There was just a tremendous amount of, shall we say, alteration, a minor alteration, but significant to the Castillo itself. And it lasted for about 2 years and then went away. And again, there was no consideration of what might be happening to the resource. Yes, it's still in great shape, but the fact is that it happened, and that was a rarity in that time. But, you know, I kind of compare the Park Service to almost any industry in the United States. The automobile industry in 1916 was based on certain facts and certain societal methods and concerns. And so as the industry progressed, things changed. Well, the Park Service, which just celebrated its 103rd anniversary, started out with pristine resources, many of them not really close to major population centers, not receiving much visitation, if any. And over time, we've come to a point now where things have changed greatly. Visitation is extremely heavy. The use of resources is very heavy. Towns and cities and population is moving closer to the parks. And as they move closer, if there is no cooperation, there is a problem occurring within the ecosystem. So things have changed. What has changed significantly in the last 10 to 20 years, I'd go back 30 years, is there's been a huge proliferation of federal laws which require reports and require studies and involvements that take a huge amount of time. And so what's happened over time is the employees of the Park Service have been diminished by the thousands. We have a $12 billion backlog of maintenance and upkeep due us from the U.S. Congress, which has grown over the last 10 years and will continue to grow, and yet isn't being treated. And the visitation is there, the change is there. Society looks at national parks in a different way, and yet our management is still looking as though we were, kind of a 1950 model of society. The Park Service needs to upgrade. It needs to upgrade its management. It needs to not improve, but really train employees far more than they are currently receiving. Employees who work their heads off in support of the parks and have to work really hard. Right now, instead of having the number of employees we need to figure out where the future is going, where's our money going to come from in the future? Are we always going to be kind of an offset of the Congress, or should we be something more like a Smithsonian, where we have consummate professionals really in charge, not just politicians and the Department of Interior? These are issues that need to be addressed now, and yet we're still not seeing it. We have problems in almost all parks in terms of visitation and maintenance problems and certain loss of resource. A lot of historic structures. When we talk about Independence Hall and having that available for our grandchildren, we're not interested in having it having it torn down in 10 years because it wasn't up to speed and then rebuilding it. Our goal is to carry it forward as it is. and we need to address that. Well, we're $12 billion in the hole, and what does Congress do this year? They put out a new resource bill for parks, forests, and BLM, and so they add 3 more national monuments to the National Park Service. We just keep growing, and the reason we're growing, and the reason that we're so popular, is that America has discovered that parks mean economic development. That a lot of people come to the parks. Some $84 billion a year are created by and bring to various communities that money, and so it's really neat. If you've got an old enough structure, let's make it a national monument, and we can make that into something. So not only are we creating parks, we're probably reducing the significance. We should be really focusing on parks and resources that are true national and international significance, not just the country store down the road, which happened to be visited by somebody in 1915 and making that a national monument. So, that's kind of an overview of some of the issues we're facing, and Mount Everest is a great example.
I thought it would be, and here's what's unique. We're reducing, the resources. I can't remember how you just said it, but I was thinking, geez, he just kind of said that so naturally, and I was like, that was the point, because when you look at what I was talking about at Everest, you're beginning to see a lot of garbage being left on the mountain. I mean, literally, this is a spirit that just sits there and goes, I'm the biggest mountain on planet Earth, and it takes respect to come and enjoy me. It's much like I was doing an interview some years ago about a guy who wrote a book about his surfing journeys. Mm-hmm. And I remember there was a time I was watching, it was a wonderful documentary called Riding Giants, and it's about the history of big wave surfing. And it hit me at that moment that when you're a surfer and you're out there riding these big waves, that the ocean sees or feels or even senses in a way that you've actually put time in to respect exactly what it is you're involved in. And so it allows you to play with it for a while, and it wants to play with you back. Mm-hmm. But in the case of Everest, what you have are these entitled people with some cash and very little climbing experience going up there and beginning to create these problems and taking away the mystique, the beauty of what this is. And exactly. I'll tell you, just it was about a year ago, my wife and I had more or less recently moved down to Arizona, and we were up in Page, staying up there by Lake Powell, which is a magnificent lake. Absolutely. And we decided to trip on up to Utah and found ourselves, as she says, well, let's go to Zion National Park. Now, I was amazed, and you wrote an interesting, a really cool piece in there about a road that just didn't seem to work too well up there. Right. But what was cool about going to this park is I was mesmerized, and I couldn't even really describe it in words. It's that difficult, as we were able to go into the park. Now, as I understand it, the traffic is getting as such that there may be a time, maybe this year or next year, you will no longer be able to drive through the park anymore just due to the sheer volume of people beginning to show up there. Mm-hmm. Which I think is a great thing because you just don't know. But what was kind of hard about the whole thing is that I want to say we drove from the southeast entrance, the area you're coming up from Page from, to the other end. And all of a sudden, as you get toward the other end of the park, there's a lot of hotels. There's a lot of these things you're talking about that slowly encroach into an area so that you're closer to go and enjoy this. And I think to myself, as you actually talk about in your first chapter, and you're talking about Congress and the government being involved, that they're there. It was originally set up to preserve, but you got politicians involved. How much longer does it take before a place like Zion has some billionaire who's got a favor from a politician that's owed to him is going to build one of his big mansions up on one of those petrified dunes? I mean, how much longer will it be before that happens? And it gets concerning.
It is concerning, and the fact is that, for instance, continuing with Everest. Everest should be a life experience, and it should be one that when you leave the mountain, you respect mountains in general, and you respect the terrain, you respect the experience. Well, that was the case in the 40s and 50s, okay, but today technology has changed. It's become easier. It's become far less dangerous if you can spend certain funds to get to the top of Everest. Those changes are making the experience, as you say, less. And there are some real concerns there for what happens. We have technology today coming in. For instance, what's our response going to be to drones? Drones are going to have an effect on National Park Service areas. They can come in from outside. It's a matter of maybe it's just pictures, but nevertheless, it is a disturbance for those on the ground. as at Big Bend, when we had military aircraft using Big Bend for a 500-foot flyover, I had to go back to the Randolph Air Force Base to get that taken care of, to convey the fact that forests and parks are not overflight areas for military aircraft, which was taken care of. But again, it's the technology, it's the expectation of people, it's the ease that we're getting to. Floating down the Colorado River in 1900 was a different experience than it is today, and it's still a good experience. I hope people get to enjoy that. But when they get off the river, I would certainly like them to remember that experience and to remember the value to them of that experience in terms of the future of the parks and the future of ecosystems, which is very important to our grandchildren today.
Now, one thing that you definitely talk about in the book, National Parks Are a Living Treasure, is, the idea of government and the National Park Service and the way they may be able to use national parks for what they would consider to be their pursuit of science. And I found that to be something like, that's quite unique here, especially when you think about farmers and ranchers that aren't too far. In fact, there was a particular thing that I believe it occurred at Yellowstone, the Wyoming portion of it, where they were getting really frustrated with coyotes. So they decided, well, let's go on this extermination thing here. Let's cheer the rancher on. But what they discovered, for each coyote that they killed, it was being replaced by something like 7 new coyotes. So, in fact, trying to exterminate the population only caused an increase in it. It's pretty crazy what they do when it comes to wildlife control. What were some of the experiences that you would like to share with our listeners today when it comes to this particular modality?
Well, in terms of critters, let's use an example at Big Bend National Park in Texas. First of all, if there was a cow or a sheep killed anywhere within 200 miles of Big Bend, it was a mountain lion from Big Bend that did the deed. There had been a historic perception of danger. Well, there was research conducted up in the Carlsbad area where that problem was also occurring, and what the researchers found, going to your last point, is that if you have mountain lions in the area, the best thing to do is don't go out and randomly kill them. Determine lions have a territory that's literally more than 100 miles in square, not square, but 100 miles of it. And if you've got a lion that isn't bothering your sheep or cattle, don't kill it, because your chances are you're going to get a lion replacing it, and that lion may very well go for cattle and sheep. So the whole idea is that you can achieve a natural balance if you're willing to work at it. When I was going up to Glacier, on my way, I was listening to the radio, and I was hearing about how the wolves were reintroducing themselves from Canada into Glacier, and they were talking about, we have a science staff at Glacier, at least we did, I'm sure we still do, that was getting involved with research on the wolves. And all of a sudden I'm hearing about how the wolves are going to be given names. and all of a sudden I'm hearing things like Susie and Fred and George and so forth. And I got to the park, and it didn't take me very long to walk down the road to the Science Center and say basically, hey, what are we doing here? I'm going to be managing this park. It's a very delicate situation, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be held up in the papers for having to take George down for some reason. We do not name our wildlife in that fashion. They can have numbers, they can have whatever you want, but let's not let a child understand that the superintendent is out at the park killing George and Fred and Sam, if that ever comes to pass. And again, it doesn't have to, and it usually doesn't. At Big Bend, we were also a place where we had a child that was pretty badly molested by a lion, and when we had to bring in some trackers, we tracked it down and killed it because of rabies, and we needed to understand what was happening. Well, the paws on the lion were bleeding, and it was very, very hungry. And again, it's an example of ranchers and others in the area that find the young lions to be pets. They create the pet, they take it out of the natural environment, and then it becomes too big. And instead of just trying to work with that, they sometimes bring them to the park and let them go. Now they're in an environment where they don't really know how to survive, and they're not going to be good at it, and that resulted in the particular attack that I'm talking about. There are consequences for things that can occur in parks and outside of parks, and again, we're needing to do that. Research is very important to the parks. Having visionaries working to try and determine how we're going to deal with visitation, how are we going to deal with crowds of people, how are we going to respond to the issues that we know are going to be coming toward us. When I was active in the parks, we didn't have the digital invasion that we have now, where everything is out there on the internet. It has changed dramatically. And we could have foretold that was coming, but we really had no preparation for it. And
right.
Not that we could control it, not that we can make any change in it, but we could prepare for it. We could at least bring ourselves up. And another aspect is training of our employees. When you work in the Park Service, you have an opportunity to work at any one of 23 various types of parks, monuments, memorials, historic sites. And each of those sites, each of them is individual. It's an individual treasure, and it has individual characteristics and individual needs. And we need to better train employees who are moving from one national park to another national park, which has a different set of values and needs. And that requires, we require bringing our employees up into management very carefully and with more training, giving them the ability to work well. And when we have a superintendent like at Big Bend, we worked on creating the units in Mexico to allow for us to eventually get to an international peace park, which was envisioned in 1932. I started an intensive program in 84, working toward relations with Mexico. Well, what we did is we put a bridge across the river, so to speak. We established ourselves as being respectful of Mexico, of understanding the importance of its resources, and creating an environment in which discussions could be held. That was followed by, it took 4 superintendents after me to ultimately create millions of acres of parkland across from Big Bend in Mexico. That was a 25-year process. It occurred because the management that followed worked along the same lines. but that's rare. Often we have a superintendent that comes in and creates an environment, and the superintendent that comes in after that person, who transfers out after 5 or 6 years, has no bearing with what the past superintendent was doing, what the goals were, where they were trying to move with the resource, and it all starts over again. New relationships, new ideas. Nothing wrong with new ideas, but we should be respectful of what happened in the past, and we don't receive an opportunity to do that. We don't bring in new superintendents and have them work for a period of time with an old superintendent, not age-wise, but position-wise, to basically get an understanding of what the goals were, what they were trying to move to. What are your long-range goals here? If you're starting a program to deal with visitation, you don't restart that every 5 years, because it means that visitation is going to continue to grow, the resource is going to continue to be impacted, and the decisions that need to be made that are important and controversial are not going to be made, because, again, a senator or congressman will intercede because of some aspect that economically they don't like. It takes time to do those things. And, again, this is where the Park Service is, to me, losing ground, and it's a concern that we need to and can deal with. My goal, which will not be achieved soon or maybe never, but I really believe that what's needed now is a national commission of individuals who are involved with not recreation, but parks, ecosystems, organizations that work with us and so forth, but to have that commission really divorce itself from the Department of Interior and the Congress, and sit down and figure out, what do we want, what are we trying to do with the parks? How are we going to bring them into the future, given all the changes that are going to occur in society? What should we be prepared for? How should the Park Service be funded? Should we allow the parks to come up with a $12 billion hole in the ground called needs that we're not getting? We have to rethink and really work on this. And again, politicians are not going to be interested in this type of thing. The secretaries are not going to be interested in this kind of thing. But we really need to do a rethink, not for opening the doors, but for really putting the resources in position for their future. If we don't, somebody else will, and again, we have no idea as to what might happen there.
Now, the possibility might be what happened when I was growing up in a little town called Malino, Oregon, where we used to have within walking distance a natural river that flowed that we used to go swimming at in the summertime, and then in the wintertime the salmon would actually flow. A lot of them were laying eggs. I mean, you got to see these gargantuan fish up close and personal. And it got to a point that some people decided to build houses right up on the ridge, on the path that we used to walk to get down to the river. Now it became private property, so now we could never go down to the river again. And that's the possibility there if it's just kind of let go and forgotten about.
Well, it happens. It happens so many times. Mm-hmm. And it's repeating. But again, when I was at Glacier, I'm sure there were people within the park who were not happy with me, and they didn't need to be. But the fact was that, in my mind, if you have an assistant superintendent working within a park, as those big parks do, the management of the park on the interior is really the ballpark of the assistant superintendent. The superintendent is really the bridge to the communities. The superintendent needs to be involved, not only within the park, but outside the park, establishing relations with organizations and kind of working within the county governments and the town governments and trying to establish an understanding of why it's important around surrounding parks not to build subdivisions up next to the boundary, but to zone and plan those areas so that the park itself is not damaged and that the animals which need space to move out of the park. They don't all just live in the park. That they're not being taken out because they have walked over the boundary. Those are issues that are resolvable, but they have to be worked at, and it does take time. But again, in some of our older parks, the attitude is, it's the superintendent's job to do everything within the park, and outside the park will take care of itself somehow. That's a past attitude, and it's way past. We can't afford that anymore.
Now, as our listeners are listening to this today, what would you suggest they could do to get perhaps proactively involved besides reading your book and getting a feel for what National Park Service is all about, what's really intrinsically involved here? Because there's a lot more to it than just, let's keep trash out of the park and leave the animals alone sort of a thing. And the same thing with the monuments, that sort of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question is the hardest one to answer. It's going to take individuals and individuals within organizations to come to an understanding that national parks are just not coffee table books. It's so easy to fall in love with the photographs of the parks and to think they're in great shape, to view the historic, the archaeological, and so forth. But there needs to be an understanding that there are issues affecting the parks, and that's what my book is trying to accomplish, and then to have them become involved in some fashion through and with the politicians and politics that are in control at this point in time. It's not going to be easy. The politicians are not going to be favorably inclined because, again, putting a National Park Service unit into one of their districts is, an election issue in some cases. It's awareness, and it is flowing that awareness into some type of action. My only hope is that there are some individuals out there that have strong relationships, strong associations that can raise issues and get them heard. And that the individual on the street who doesn't have those connections can find someone who does, and they can make an effort out of basically asking for things to be at least looked at in terms of the national parks and their future. It's so important. Back in the 90s, I worked with some groups in conservation on the issue of the commission, and they would all say, "Well, that's a good idea. We'll go back and talk to the secretary about it." And at that point, I would say, "Well, forget it," because if you take the idea of a commission back to the secretary is going to say, "Oh, we don't need to do that." There is going to be a resistance to doing it because that's just in the nature of bureaucracy. There's no easy way to do this. It's going to take a groundswell to ultimately create some change. And I don't know what the answers are. All I have is concern. And answers are going to need to come from people far smarter and far more involved than I'll ever be. But it needs to start. It started somehow in 1916 to create the national parks. And again, I'm hoping it can start again in terms of bringing the parks back to the status that they had 30 years ago when they were in pretty good shape. And get us back into being the conservators and preservators of the future national park sites and the sites which represent the heritage of our nation and the history of our nation. We have political correctness emerging on the scene, and political correctness is going to be a growing issue. And are our parks yet equipped to deal with communities and groups that want to come in and change parks because they don't like a name or they don't like its history or they want to defame somebody? I mean, there needs to be...
I totally hear what you're saying there. It gets ridiculous, in fact.
It is.
I was thinking when you were talking about technology, I didn't share this experience, but we decided to stop at Horseshoe up in Page on our way back. And now... to give you some perspective, about 9 months before that, when we had first moved to Arizona, we had actually went up to northeastern Arizona, Canyon de Chelly, that area up there, and then we also had went over to an area called Mexican Hat, which was into the valley, Monuments Valley. Beautiful place. And we happened to go at the time of year nobody was up there. You got to imagine how cool that was. And so we went up to Goosenecks, which was about 8 or 9 miles from the hotel that we stayed at on the San Joaquin River. And again, there was probably one other person staying at the hotel while we were up there. So we go out to Goosenecks, and of course the place you pay was shut down. They were closed, and there was, I think, one little RV up there that looked like it had been there for days. But we were the only ones up there. Now, that's why I give this perspective, because we were up there at the sunrise. We're enjoying this moment, just taking it all in. And I was somebody as a kid who loved dinosaurs, so reading up the kinds of books that I did, this was a place that came alive for me because of that reason, thinking about the prehistoric times and the Native Americans and things just like that, and just taking in the spirit of how just grand and beautiful this all was. Now, flash forward to going to Horseshoe. Now, that's certainly a beautiful place to visit, don't get me wrong, but I became very disgusted. And why is because what you've seen is a long stream of people going down from the roadside of the parking area down to Horseshoe looking like ants that were hauling food in the Amazon jungle. You get to the edge of this beautiful place, and what you see is a bunch of arrogant kids, taking these, cover model picture selfies on their cell phones. And nobody's just sitting there and just taking it all in.
Yeah.
And so when you talked about technology, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Like, I don't know if I ever want to go back to Horseshoe again. As great as that place was, it was just infested with people that were all self-concerned. And so when you talk about political correctness, oh my, it doesn't take much imagination to see how something like that can become eventually very destructive for everything.
Absolutely. And if we're not prepared to deal with it, we're going to be the difference between reaction and proaction is quite big in my mind. We position ourselves to react to crisis. I'd much rather us be proactive in terms of anticipating crisis and being prepared for it, having things set up so that we have an approach. There are 300, now we've added 3, so now we're up to 486 National Park Service areas, each with a manager. And, we've got a few regions. We don't need a whole lot of regions. But again, there needs to be a consistent policy. For years now, we've allowed for major issues to basically be determined in individual parks, issues that are national. Not just local. And instead of trying to come up with an approach for certain kinds of issues, each manager does, and you wind up with a smorgasbord of ideas and concepts, some of which work and some of which don't. But you never know, because we simply don't approach that from a national level. And when I came into the service in '62, politics was in the hands of the director, George Hartzog. That was Connie Worth at the time, but George Hartzog. And now what's happened over the decades is that individual superintendents now, each seem to deal, and there's reason for this, because they've not been successful in getting funds for supporting the park. So each superintendent has begun to get involved with politics. So basically now the director goes up to the Hill in order to seek funding. And what he's hearing back is that, I hear that that's not the case, Mr. Director, that the superintendent out there tells me that such and such. It creates confusion. It helps get in the way. And again, it's we just need to have a better organizational pattern and a better way of viewing the issues that we face today. When you deal in an organization like the Park Service, when you have a history of people who've worked for it their whole life, change is not an easy issue always, but yet we should be an organization that is capable of understanding change and dealing with it in some constructive fashion.
Well, Gil, it's been a wonderful pleasure to bring you on the program. I only really have one final question. It's a stretch, but did you ever see Bigfoot?
No, I didn't, and I did look for the little fella.
I'm sure you did, especially up in Glacier.
Yeah, and all I could think of, I did find some remains once of a small person that didn't make it, and I think that might have been at least part of a Bigfoot. It sure looked like it, very hairy, very long nails, strange thing.
Gotcha. So the X-Files wasn't too far off. Well, thank you again for joining us here on the program. I know it seems like, and it is, can be a very complex issue, especially when you put it into the political arena because everybody's positioning for favoritism and, as you said, re-election and votes. The book is National Parks Are a Living Treasure, A Time for Concern. Is there a website people can go to find out more about you, your work, or how they can become more proactive and at least knowing what's going on?
Well, there is a website. It's nps500.com, simply nps500.com. And there they can get information about myself and, about the book and some reviews and other things. I really haven't put up yet a piece about what can be done. I'm wanting to get a little more feedback from in terms of the book, and that will be there at some point. It's just not there yet.
Well, I know one thing maybe the listeners could do is take the suggestion, when you go to these parks or these monuments, as important it is to show that you were there on your cell phone, why don't you put it away for a while and get a feel of the spirit of the place? And perhaps as that happens, you'll find something, an answer in yourself that helps you become more proactive in this process to make sure that things don't continue on the current path that they're on.
Absolutely. With more than 300 million visits a year to the parks, I'd like to think that at least a few 100,000 of them really came away with an extremely strong view about the parks and the value to culture today, and wanting to do something. I mean, we have 220,000 volunteers these days because we've been reduced so much in staffing. So there's a real will in support of the parks, but it has to be more than just working in a park. We need to be, as we've said, really looking at some of the bigger issues and how we can affect that.
Well, Gil, again, I want to thank you so much for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Again, I know people will enjoy what they read, especially your intermix of history, personal experiences, things like that you wrote throughout the book, and I look forward to finishing it. A lot of fun. It was bringing back a lot of memories for me as a kid growing up and going to a lot of these places like Yellowstone and how different it was then compared to now. I just don't even know how much I would be able to recognize it, just because of the sheer volume of people that show up. And again, as we were talking about building on the fringes, things like that, it's just like, really, time to maybe slow this down a little bit. Thanks again.
Have you got time for one more example?
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and take one more?
Yellowstone comes to mind immediately. Because of technology and the changes, there's a huge amount of winter visitation there. And so the roads that used to be laden with snow are plowed and taken care of. And so if you get up at this time of year early in the morning and drive out of Yellowstone on one of the main roads, you're going to be traveling within perhaps 100 semi-trucks. And by that I mean the wintertime, when the bison are active, they have discovered that roads are really nice ways to transport, to move from meadow to meadow. And so they use the roads for highways themselves. And in the summertime, they don't change. They still use the highways for that. And there's been examples lately about cars being this way and that way. And, well, it's just one of the things that happens when you change the characteristics, some of the strange things that can come out of that. It's kind of a fun thing. I've experienced it, and it's kind of amazing.
That's right up there with "Don't Feed the Bears" as you see an idiot in front of you in a car roll his window down and do that very thing as I remember seeing when I was a kid in Yellowstone.
Oh, absolutely.
Gil, thanks again for being on the program today. It's been
Daniel,
a pleasure.
thank you so much. I really do appreciate it.
All right.
Take care now.
We
Bye-bye.
want to thank you, the listeners out there. If you're going to visit another treasure, visit us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter. Keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.